Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for letting me make a small contribution to your discussion today. Sorry I can't be with you on Zoom, but I'm glad that I could do this by recording. My name's Samantha. I work for the International Trade Union Confederation. We're a global federation for most of the world's unions. We represent over 200 million organized workers in 162 countries. In India, our affiliates are CFTUI, HMS, INTUC, and SEWA. I want to start by expressing solidarity with our members and all workers in India who are protesting for fair work conditions, fair labor laws, fair agricultural laws. We are with you. I work at the Just Transition Center of the ITUC. We were set up, the center, in 2016 after the agreement in the International Labor Organization of UN standards for just transition, and also the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. And we do a very simple thing. We help unions get good plans for just transition. A good plan for just transition brings down CO2 emissions, methane emissions, and most importantly, it improves the material conditions of workers. I won't go into all of the details about the UN process or national examples and so on, because we've actually been asked to talk about something a bit more concrete. And that is, first, how do we see the energy transition happening? And what do we think our role in it is? Second, the costs and pitfalls of the transition. And third, are there good and progressive and even radical things that are happening on just transition? And how do we think that those things could be promoted or increased? So just to start with the first question, how do we see the energy transition happening now, and what do we think our role is in it? I think the first point is that the energy transition is happening in actually a lot of different countries. And the main reason we think that it's happening is, again, about material conditions. Is basically that the technology of renewable energy, particularly solar power, exists. It's now cost competitive or even costs less than coal-fired power. And so that in turn is changing structures in the energy system. As you know, the International Energy Agency even just published a report saying that solar power in India is, in fact, the cheapest electrical energy source in the world. So the question about energy transition now becomes, how do we do it, and why shouldn't we do it, as opposed to whether we can do it and why? In terms of how I personally, and maybe ITUC, how we see our role in the energy transition, it's about supporting our members and all workers, people who ideally should be members of a union, in mobilizing for a just energy transition. So it's all about the how. And our job, if you like, in this is to help people through empowering them through knowledge and examples and best practice, helping them, if possible, get into social dialogue with employers and governments so that the new jobs are good jobs. And everyone who today is working in the value chain of coal has social protection and it has a pathway to dignified retirement or a good new job. I think this is also a kind of self-sustaining process. So the more people who get good new jobs in renewable energy or other parts of the energy transition, building grids, building community-owned solar and so on, the more people will support this transition because they'll see something good in it for themselves. They'll see access to or having abundant, affordable, clean energy, and they will also see good jobs in it. So you also create political constituencies for the energy transition by helping workers get good jobs as it goes along. On the other hand, the more people who lose their jobs in coal without any kind of plan, without social protection or income support, without a new job to go to, the harder it's going to be to have an energy transition because people are going to resist you, right? They don't just sit there while this happens. Eventually, you get large groups of people who are unemployed, who are angry because they've lost work, and who don't see a future for themselves. So that takes me to the next point, which is about the costs of the transition, the pitfalls, the risks, the problems, and so on. First of all, just transition is a really specific thing, right? So it's not just any kind of climate action that has a social aspect. It's very specifically and always based on social dialogue, which always involves unions, workers and their unions, employers and their associations, and often government, sometimes communities. So what we could say about just transition is there's no just transition without social dialogue. There's no social dialogue without unions. There are no unions without labor rights. And if you want to have just transition, then you need to have more and better labor rights. And that is definitely not the situation we're in a growing number of countries around the world. I think a second big issue for getting a just transition is the idea that energy transition is just going to happen through market forces and somehow people will end up in new jobs and you won't have this massive dislocation of workers and communities as a big industry starts to either close down or transform. And we can just look around at previous industrial transitions or even what's happening with coal transition in a lot of countries and see that that's not how it works. You can't just leave it to the markets. Not going to happen. Instead, what you get is that both people and regions get left behind, and that in turn creates an angry, unemployed constituency who are opposed to energy transition. So I think another big pitfall for getting a just energy transition is not having social protection, because as you have this gigantic change in the power sector or in mining, people need income support, they need reskilling, they need healthcare, they need a bridge to pensions so they can be secure in their old age. And in all the places where you don't get that, again, you not only get a lot of people suffering, but you also get a lot of people who are angry. Another key point on energy transition, like what can go wrong, is that often, especially if you're thinking about the climate impacts, for example, of coal-fired power or other high-emitting industries, there's a big focus on shutting stuff down before you even start to think about planning for the future, about new jobs. And in our experience, it really doesn't work. So the best examples of just transition are where there's planning ahead of time and the new jobs are in place. The new jobs are good jobs. People are seeing this future for themselves. They're involved in negotiating it. And then stuff starts to close. Because if you do it the other way around, again, you get back to the theme of this, which is that people and regions get left behind. Two last points about what can go wrong. I think it's important to understand just generally, both in rich countries, but also in developing countries and emerging economies, that the cost of energy is really key. And so in a transition, the people, poor and working class households should not be bearing the costs of transition of different kinds. You need to keep energy affordable, if not free, for people. Otherwise, again, they're not going to have access to energy. It's a basic right, and they're also going to oppose the transition. And then finally, there's a cluster of issues around privatization, and also these new renewable energy companies, which in many countries are anti-union. So basically, in some countries, the road to decarbonizing, to introducing more renewable energy, has gone through privatizing state-owned utilities, privatizing distribution, and so on. And um, what what we've realized, and what even the World Bank has realized after decades of pushing privatization in the power sector, is that there's really no connection between privatization and decarbonizing the power sector. So they're two different things. And so what we see a lot is that governments will introduce privatization saying that this is about climate action, when it's really about something else entirely. What we know as unions is that privatization almost always means job losses. And the new companies that come in a privatization scheme are often really anti-union. So you lose, not only do people lose their jobs, which again leads to a lot of suffering, but also you lose the ability to have effective labor rights in the new companies. And then you lose the ability to fight to make sure that these are good jobs and to really get a just transition. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the alternatives. Like, what are the good things that are happening? What are things that could be scaled up and so on? What we're seeing is that just transition, national plans for just transition, regional plans for just transition, even company level and sector level plans for just transition. We're seeing this in all regions of the world, looking very different in different places. So a potential just transition India will look really different from the way it looks in Germany, or the way it looks in South Africa, or the way it looks in Canada. But having said that, it actually is happening, and that's something that at least gives me hope, because just transition is not an incremental vision. It's not just sort of tinkering around the edges. The idea is itself progressive and positive and radical. And it's the idea that every working person is entitled to decent work, to a good job with fair wages, with pension, with health and safety at work, with skills and training. And also that the point of the world of work is, at least in part, to eradicate poverty. So that just transition also rests on this foundation of fair tax and reducing inequality and making sure that poor and working class people are protected by income support systems. I think, with that in mind, just thinking about the big examples of just transition that we have right now, Germany is one of the world's largest industrialized economies, up until recently, very dependent on coal-fired power, also in industry. And it's now phasing out thermal coal by 2038. So in less than 20 years, Germany will shut off the last of its coal-fired power plants, and it is also phasing out nuclear power at the same time. And this process has started, and it seems to be going well. And maybe most importantly, it was negotiated with German labor unions. They support it because it does actually have a pathway for every single worker. There are big plans for regional redevelopment, repowering of what today are coal-fired power stations. So people really see a future for themselves. They see that it's probably going to be okay. Another example I'd like to lift up is actually from South Africa. I mean, we've been working quite a bit with the South African unions, just as sort of international experts or supports. And in South Africa, what's happened is that unions have taken their pension funds and invested them in the state-owned utility Eskom, which provides whatever it is, 90+% of South Africa's power. And as Eskom has had more financial difficulties, unions have converted that investment, that debt investment, into ownership. So they're actually now part owners of this state-owned company. And Eskom is trying slowly to transform itself from being a company a public entity that only produces coal-fired power, to starting to look at how it can both drive a just transition as it's closing some of its coal-fired power plants and also start to produce renewable energy. So it's established an Office of Just Transition within the state-owned entity, and it's putting together just closure plans for plants that are going to close. And these include measures for communities, measures for workers, but also potentially repowering some of the coal-fired power stations so that they become renewable energy, so that they're powered by wind and solar. That's a pretty radical example. Worker ownership, a coal-fired power company slowly transforming itself and its assets into renewable energy assets. And I at least think it's pretty hopeful because it really is worker-driven. I'm going to stop there. I want to wish you good luck with your discussions. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to make a small contribution to what you'll talk about today. Thanks.